Chapter 1. The Body in the Banker's Study. The fog clung to London like a shroud, muffling the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the whispers of secrets buried in the city's cobblestone veins. Detective Adrian Cole stood at the threshold of 12 Belgrave Square, his sharp grey eyes scanning the opulent townhouse where Edward Whitcomb, a titan of British finance, lay dead in his study. The air smelled of mahogany, ink and iron, the latter pooling beneath the banker's head like a morbid halo. "Blunt force trauma," declared Dr. Martin, crouching beside the body. His voice, always measured, carried a hint of unease. Struck from behind, likely with that. He nodded to a bloodied brass candlestick discarded near the fireplace, its intricate engravings glinting in the gaslight. Adrian noted the absence of defensive wounds on Whitcomb's hands, the pristine state of his diamond cufflinks. He didn't see it coming, Martin added, or he trusted his killer. Trust, a fragile commodity in a house where wealth dripped from every chandelier. The staff, a butler, a housemaid, and a cook, had been sequestered in the kitchen, their faces pale as the porcelain teacups they clutched. But it was the absence of one person that sharpened Adrian's focus. Charles Whitcomb, the victim's nephew and sole heir, who had reportedly boarded a steamship to New York 3 days prior. "An alibi spanning an ocean," Adrian muttered, flipping through telegrams sent from the SS Laurentia. According to the ship's log, Charles had dined in its first-class salon at 8 p.m. on February 28th, the exact hour his uncle's skull had been shattered. Time zones, Adrian mused. 5 hours separated London from New York. A man could be in 2 places at once if he played the clock like a fiddle, but the alibi stank of calculation. Charles stood to inherit not only Whitcomb's fortune, but also his seat on the board of London Continental Bank, a position Edward had threatened to revoke after rumours of Charles' gambling debts surfaced. Greed was motive enough, but Adrian's instincts prickled at the neatness of it all. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard barged in, his moustache twitching with impatience. "Cut this one quick, Cole. The press is already howling about the Mayfair mauler." Adrian ignored him, crouching to examine a torn steamship ticket lodged beneath the study's Persian rug. SS Laurentia, departure, February 25th. The date jogged his memory. Leap year. "Martin," Adrian said quietly, "fetch the ship's passenger logs and cross-reference them with the Maritime Almanac." The doctor arched an eyebrow, but obeyed. Meanwhile, Adrian interrogated the staff. The butler, voice trembling, recalled a heated argument between Edward and Charles the night before the murder. "Something about legacies," he whispered. The housemaid mentioned a cryptic letter delivered to Edward that morning. A letter now missing. As dusk settled, Martin returned, clutching a leather-bound ledger. "The Laurentia log confirms Charles boarded on the 25th, he said. But their calendar," he flipped to a page marked February. "They accounted for the leap year. February 29th is noted here." Adrian's lips curved into a cold smile. But if Charles' alibi hinges on February 28th in New York, that date would already be March 1st in London. Unless... He trailed off, mind racing. The ship's log had correctly added the leap day. But had Charles? A miscalculation could compress time, erasing a day. A fatal day. "Wire the New York police," Adrian ordered. "Verify Charles' whereabouts on the 28th. And dig deeper into those debts. I want to know who he owed and what they threatened." As Martin left, Adrian lingered in the study, his reflection fractured in the shattered mirror above Whitcomb's desk. The pieces were there, the ticket, the time zones, the leap year. But the candlestick nagged him. Why use a weapon so ornate, so traceable, unless it was a message, a symbol, or a distraction? By midnight, the answer came. Charles had indeed been seen aboard the Laurentia. But witnesses placed him in the ship's telegraph office at odd hours, sending coded messages to an unknown recipient. Meanwhile, a pawn shop owner in Soho admitted to purchasing a rare jade brooch from Charles days before the murder. Pawned for a fraction of its worth, the man said. Desperation, plain as day. Adrian steepled his fingers, the puzzle tightening. Charles needed money. Charles had the means. But the alibi. It was clever, almost perfect, except for the leap year, a day that didn't exist, or one that someone had tried to erase. As the clock chimed 2, Martin burst in, waving a telegram. New York confirms. Charles attended a dinner at the Waldorf on the 28th, but the hotel's calendar had already turned to March 1st. The time difference, it's a gap, Adrian. A gap he didn't account for. The detective's eyes hardened. Then let's close it. Chapter 2. The Phantom Passenger. The docks of Southampton hissed with rain as Detective Adrian Cole and Dr. Martin boarded the SS Laurentia, its towering smokestacks bleeding coal dust into the leaden sky. The ship's return to England had been expedited by Scotland Yard, its first-class passengers grumbling about delays as detectives combed cabins for traces of Charles Whitcomb's phantom alibi. Adrian's coat dripped onto the polished teak deck, his gaze fixed on the ship's master-at-arms, a wiry man named Hargrove, whose sun-leathered face tightened at their questions. Mr. Whitcomb kept to himself, Hargrove insisted, leading them to cabin B12. Dined alone, mostly. Polite, but jumpy. The cabin was immaculate, save for a half-empty bottle of bourbon and a crumpled shipping timetable stuffed beneath the bed. Adrian sifted through it, noting circles around February 28th and scribbled calculations in the margins. Time zones converted, tides annotated. He planned this, Martin observed, peering at the timetable. But even with the leap day oversight, how could he be in 2 places at once? Adrian didn't answer. His attention snagged on a faint smudge of ink on the cabin's desk, a partial address. Mond Street, New York. He pocketed the timetable just as a stewardess, her hands raw from scrubbing, hesitated in the doorway. Saw him arguing with a gentleman the night we left Southampton, she blurted. A red-haired man. They mentioned settling debts before New York. Red hair. Adrian's mind flashed to the pawn shop owner's description of Charles' creditor. A man with hair like fire who had threatened him in Soho. Coincidence? Or a thread pulling taut? Back in London, the rain had hardened into sleet. At Scotland Yard, Inspector Lestrade slammed a dossier on his desk. Charles' debts traced to a loan shark named Silas Crowe. Runs a gambling den in Whitechapel. Nasty piece of work. The file contained photographs of Crowe, flame-haired, scarred knuckles, and a ledger detailing Charles' losses. £50,000 a sum that would beggar even a Whitcomb heir. Crowe has been arrested twice for extortion, Lestrade added. But he is slippery. Claims he was in Dublin during the murder. Adrian's jaw tightened. Verify it. And pull Crowe's telegraph records. If he and Charles conspired, there will be a trail. That evening, in the dim glow of his Baker Street study, Adrian spread the evidence like tarot cards, the shipping timetable, the pawned brooch, Crowe's photograph. Martin paced, clutching a telegram from New York. The Waldorf staff confirmed Charles dined there on the 28th, but the maitre d' recalled him checking his pocket watch constantly, as if waiting for something. Or someone, Adrian murmured. His fingers traced the smudged address from the ship. Mond Street. Telegraph the NYPD again. Have them search for businesses or residences on Edmund or Raymond Streets connected to Crowe or the Whitcomb Bank. The next morning brought a breakthrough and a corpse. Silas Crowe was found floating in the Thames, his throat slit and pockets emptied. No identification, but the red hair was unmistakable. A silencing, Martin concluded, examining the body at the morgue. Killed within the last 12 hours. No defensive wounds. He knew his attacker. Adrian's mind raced. If Crowe was dead, who had Charles feared enough to kill his uncle? And why now? He revisited Edward Whitcomb's study, now dusted for prints and reeking of antiseptic. The torn steamship ticket still haunted him. February 25th, 3 days before the murder. Time enough for a man to cross the Atlantic, or to fake it. A knock startled him, Mrs. Ellis, the Whitcomb's cook, stood wringing her apron. I didn't say before, but the night Master Charles left, I heard him on the telephone. Something about a sister ship and adjusting the clocks. Adrian stilled. Sister ship. The SS Laurentia had a twin vessel, the SS Lyra, which had departed Southampton a day earlier on the same transatlantic route. If Charles had switched ships mid-voyage, a near impossible feat, he could have shaved a day off his journey. But how? Wire the Lyra's captain. Adrian ordered Martin. Ask if they encountered the Laurentia en route, and if any passengers transferred. As they waited, Adrian unearthed another clue, a coded message buried in Charles' cabin wastebasket. Decrypted, it read, "Delay ledger until March 1st. LC shares must fall." The London Continental Bank. Edward Whitcomb had opposed a merger that would devalue shares, a merger Charles now stood to control. Greed, yes, but this reeked of conspiracy. Martin returned, triumphant. The Lyra captain confirmed fog delayed them near Newfoundland. The Laurentia overtook them on February 27th. They exchanged mail sacks via rowboat, but no passengers. Unless someone lied, Adrian countered. He requisitioned both ships' crew manifests. Comparing them revealed a discrepancy. A John Clark had boarded the Lyra but never disembarked in New York. A ghost passenger. Clark, Martin breathed. Charles' middle name is Clark. Adrian's pulse quickened. If Charles had boarded the Lyra under a false name, transferred to the Laurentia during the mail exchange, and arrived in New York officially on the 28th, he could have doubled back to London using a faster vessel. But the timing. The leap day, Martin realized. February 29th. If the Laurentia log included it, but Charles' alibi ignored it, he would gain an extra day. He could have sailed back to England on the 28th, killed his uncle, and still been in New York on the same date. But how? Adrian pressed. Even the fastest steamers take 6 days. Unless he didn't sail back, Martin interrupted, eyes alight. He stayed in London. The alibi wasn't for the murder. It was for his escape after. The dinner at the Waldorf was staged, witnesses bribed. He killed Edward, then boarded a waiting ship to New York, exploiting the time zone gap to prove he was overseas. Adrian frowned. Plausible, but incomplete. Then why the pawned brooch? The coded messages? This is bigger than one murder, Martin. Charles wasn't just erasing his uncle. He was covering tracks for someone else. A telegram arrived, slicing through the tension. NYPD reports. 27 Edmund Street is a brokerage firm tied to LC Bank. Manager vanished yesterday. Vanished. Like Crow. Like the truth. Adrian stood, clasping his coat. We need to find that manager and subpoena the bank's ledgers. If Charles was manipulating shares, others are involved. This isn't an inheritance play. It's a financial coup. As they departed, a shadow detached from the alleyway across Baker Street. A red-haired figure watching. Chapter 3. Ledgers and Lies. The heart of London's financial district pulsed with the clatter of typewriters and the sharp tang of ambition. Detective Adrian Cole navigated the marble halls of London Continental Bank, his footsteps echoing like a metronome counting down to ruin. The air smelled of ink and desperation, a heady mix that clung to the brokers darting between offices with ledgers clutched to their chests. Dr. Martin trailed behind, eyeing the vaulted ceilings with unease. Feels more like a cathedral than a bank, he muttered. A cathedral to greed, Adrian replied, his gaze fixed on the frosted glass door ahead, etched with the name Mr. Arthur Vickers, senior broker. The manager of 27 Edmund Street's phantom brokerage had vanished, but his office remained, a time capsule of panic. Drawers hung open, papers strewn like fallen leaves. A half-drunk cup of tea sat cold on the desk, a lipstick stain on its rim. Adrian sifted through the debris, finding a ledger page torn at the corner. The numbers blurred into a labyrinth of withdrawals and deposits, all funneling through shell companies. Martin, look here. He pointed to a series of transactions dated February 28th. Thousands moved from Whitcomb's accounts into a holding firm called North Star Ventures. But North Star doesn't exist. A ghost company, Martin said. Used to launder the debts? Worse, to bankrupt the bank. Adrian's voice hardened. If these withdrawals were made after Edward's death, they'd trigger a liquidity crisis. Shares would plummet, and whoever controls the debt could buy LC for pennies. He flipped to the ledger's last entry, a transfer scheduled for March 1st, the day after Edward's murder. Charles didn't just want his inheritance. He wanted the whole institution. A cough echoed in the doorway. Miss Clara Vickers, Arthur's sister, stood clutching a mink coat tighter around her throat. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice frayed. He knew they would come for him. Said he had uncovered something rotten. Last week, he sent me this. She handed Adrian a sealed envelope. Inside lay a key and a slip of paper. Safe Deposit Box 207, Waterloo Station. Did he say who threatened him? Adrian asked. Only that they had red hair and no conscience. Silas Crow's killer. The shadow from Baker Street. Adrian pocketed the key. Stay with her, he told Martin. I will handle the box. Waterloo Station teemed with travellers, their breaths fogging the air as Adrian slipped into the vaults beneath Platform 12. Box 207 yielded a stack of letters bound with twine. The top envelope bore Charles Whitcomb's wax seal. Arthur, delay the merger vote. Ensure the ledger reflects withdrawals on March 1st, not February. The extra day is critical. Fail me, and Crow's Associates will settle your debts. C. The extra day. February 29th. Adrian's mind raced. Charles had needed the leap day to manipulate the ledger, backdating transactions to implicate his uncle posthumously. But the murder had forced his hand too soon. A floorboard creaked behind him. Adrian turned, but the blow came swift, a truncheon to the ribs. He crumpled, catching a glimpse of red hair and a scarred hand snatching the letters. The assailant fled, melting into the crowd. Back at Baker Street, Martin cleaned Adrian's bruises with practiced efficiency. The letters? Gone. But I saw his face. The pawn shop owner's red-haired man. Not Crow. Younger. A protege. Adrian winced as antiseptic bit into his split lip. Charles didn't act alone. He is part of a syndicate, brokers, killers, bankers, all rigging the system. Martin unfolded a telegram from New York. The SS Lyra purser confessed. They did transfer a passenger during the fog, a John Clark who paid in gold to keep it quiet. Charles must have rowed to the Laurentia, then doubled back to London on a faster ship after the murder. But the alibi relied on the Waldorf's staff believing he had dined on the 28th. Witnesses can be bribed, Adrian, especially when shares are at stake. A knock cut through the night. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a trembling clerk from LC Bank. Mr. Cole, I processed Mr. Whitcomb's final withdrawal. He didn't authorize it. The signature was forged, dated March 1st, but when I checked the ledger today, it was gone. Someone altered the dates, erased a day. Adrian exchanged a glance with Martin. The leap year. February 29th had vanished from the bank's records, turning March 1st into February 28th. Charles had not only exploited time zones, he had rewritten time itself. Stay hidden, Adrian ordered the clerk. As the man scurried away, he turned to Martin. It's a house of cards. The forged transfers, the ledger dates, the sister ship, all collapse if we prove February 29th existed. Find me someone who saw Charles in London that day. And if we can't? Adrian stared into the fog beyond the window. Then we will make him confess. Dawn found them at the Whitcomb estate, where Mrs. Ellis, the cook, hesitated in the pantry. I didn't speak before, but on the 29th, I saw Master Charles. Here, in the garden. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He argued with a red-haired man, said, The ledger's fixed. Now finish it. Why come forward now? Adrian pressed. She opened her fist, revealing a jade brooch, the one Charles had pawned. Found this in the rubbish. It's Mrs. Whitcomb's. She died last year. He wouldn't part with it unless... She trailed off, tears gleaming. Unless he'd already won. Adrian took the brooch, its edges sharp as truth. Charles had been in London on the 29th. His alibi was ash. But as they left, a shot rang out. Martin gasped, clutching his shoulder. Across the street, a red-haired figure vanished into the fog, smoke curling from his revolver. Chapter 4. The Clockmaker's Secret. Rain lashed the cobblestones as Detective Adrian Cole dragged Dr. Martin into the shelter of a chemist's shop, blood seeping through the latter's coat. The bullet had grazed Martin's shoulder, but his face was pale as parchment. "Go," Martin gritted, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. "Don't let them vanish again." Adrian hesitated, his jaw taut. The red-haired assailant, Elias Crowe, Silas' younger brother, as they would later learn, had struck with the precision of a man who'd done this before. But this time, he had left a trail. A single muddy boot print outside the Whitcomb estate, its tread matching a rare Italian leather sole sold exclusively by a Bond Street cobbler. By midday, Adrian stood in the cobbler's shop, the scent of polish and gilt thick in the air. The proprietor, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, identified Elias from a police sketch. Sold him 3 pairs last autumn, paid in cash, said he travelled for business. "What kind of business?" Adrian pressed. The cobbler blanched. The kind that leaves blood on the soles. Meanwhile, Martin, bandaged and resolute, pursued another thread, the altered ledger. At London Continental Bank, he bullied his way into the archives, unearthing a carbon copy of the original transactions, neatly dated February 29th. They tried to burn it, he told Adrian that evening, slapping the singed pages onto their Baker Street desk. But fire's a fickle accomplice. The ledger proved Charles had backdated the withdrawals to implicate his uncle, exploiting the leap day's erasure. Yet one question gnawed at Adrian. How had Charles ensured the bank's clocks matched his fiction? The answer arrived in the form of a silver pocket watch delivered anonymously to their door. Its inscription read, "To E.W. for timely investments." Edward Whitcomb's initials. Martin pried open the casing, revealing tiny adjustments to the gears. This isn't just a watch, it's a metronome, programmed to lose exactly 24 hours every leap year. So Edward's personal clock would always disagree with the world, Adrian murmured. Charles must have swapped it, ensuring his uncle signed documents dated a day behind. When the murder forced the ledger's exposure, the dates aligned with Edward's time. But who altered the watch? Martin asked. This craftsmanship, it's genius. Genius with a grudge. Adrian recalled the pawned jade brooch, Mrs. Whitcomb's heirloom. Its buyer, a reclusive clockmaker named Victor Hale, operated from a workshop in Clerkenwell, his talents whispered about in elite circles. They found Hale in a dim attic, surrounded by ticking skeletons of clocks. His hands, gnarled as oak roots, trembled when Adrian mentioned Charles. He threatened my daughter, Hale confessed. Said he'd ruin her if I didn't falsify the watch. I didn't know it would be used for that. But you suspected, Adrian said coldly, holding up the watch. Who else did Charles hire? Hale's eyes darted to a ledger of his own. Page after page of names. Brokers, sailors, telegraph operators. All bribed or blackmailed. Among them, the SS Laurentia radio officer paid to falsify the ship's log, and a Waldorf Astoria waiter instructed to lie about Charles' dinner. A symphony of lies, Martin muttered. And Elias Crowe? Adrian pressed. Hale stiffened. The red-haired devil? Charles enforcer. Cleans up messes, like Silas. Like us, Adrian thought. That night, Elias struck again. Mrs. Ellis, the Whitcomb cook, was found dead in her flat, a jade brooch clutched in her hand, the same one she'd given Adrian. A note pinned to her chest read, "Stop digging." But the killer had grown sloppy. A matchbook from a Soho nightclub, the Velvet Hour, lay in the grate. Adrian and Martin arrived as the club's jazz band wailed a dirge of trumpets. The bartender, sweat gleaming on his brow, admitted Elias frequented a back room with high rollers. Inside they found cigar ash, empty champagne bottles, and a map of London marked with red X's, each a site tied to the Whitcomb Empire. Docks, banks, the family crypt. Martin traced the marks. He is taunting us, or leading us. Adrian's finger hovered over the crypt's location in Highgate Cemetery. Edward Whitcomb's tomb, unvisited since the funeral. They went at midnight, the moon veiled by clouds. The crypt's iron gate creaked open, revealing fresh footprints in the dust. Inside, Edward's coffin had been pried open, jewels stripped from his corpse. But beneath his skeletal hand lay a leather portfolio, untouched. Deeds, contracts, a confession in Edward's own hand. I discovered Charles' plot too late, it read. He and Crow's syndicate mean to collapse LC Bank, blame me and seize control. If you find this, know the ledger is false. The truth lies in... The page ended, torn. Elias! Martin shouted as a shadow lunged from the crypt's recesses. The red-haired man swung a shovel, but Adrian ducked, tackling him into the open coffin. Edward's bones scattered as they grappled, Elias' breath reeking of gin and rage. You will never prove it, Elias spat. The ship's logs are ash. The witness is dead. Adrian slammed Elias' head against the crypt wall. But the time isn't. You forgot the leap year, Elias. The one day that doesn't fit. Elias froze, his smirk faltering. Then, with a feral snarl, he smashed a hidden vial of acid onto the floor. Adrian recoiled as the liquid ate into stone, smoke stinging his eyes. Elias fled, his laughter echoing through the graveyard. Martin crouched beside the ruined confession. The last page. Did Edward say where the truth lies? Adrian lifted the portfolio, moonlight revealing indentations on the final sheet. A single word, pressed into the paper by a desperate hand. Sister. Chapter 5. The Sisters' Gambit. The Thames roared under a tempestuous sky as Detective Adrian Cole and Dr. Martin boarded the SS Lyra, its hull groaning against the dock like a beast in chains. The sister ship to the Laurentia had returned to Southampton under heavy guard, its logs now the linchpin of the case. Sailors eyed the detectives warily as they descended into the vessel's belly, where cargo manifests and crew diaries lay entombed in rusted lockboxes. The Lyra's logs from February 25th to March 1st, Adrian demanded of the ship's first mate, a gaunt man with salt-crusted lashes. The man handed over a water-stained ledger, its pages reeking of brine and deceit. Martin's finger halted on an entry dated February 28th. Mail exchange with SS Laurentia. Fog delay. Passenger transfer authorised under captain's orders. The name, John Clark, glared back, unsigned by any crew member. They lied before, Martin said. But why admit it now? Because the captain's dead, the mate muttered. Found floating by the docks last week. His throat cut. Adrian's pulse quickened. Elias Crow's work. But the ledger's truth remained. Charles had transferred ships, exploiting the leap year gap to compress time. Yet one entry baffled them. A crate marked Sister, loaded onto the Lyra in Southampton and offloaded in New York. What's inside? Adrian pressed. The mate shrugged. Bank business. Sealed by LC. Bank business. Adrian's mind raced to Edward's crypt, the word sister etched into his confession. Not a person, a vault. Back in London, they stormed LC Bank's archives, where a clerk led them to a private vault labelled Sister. Inside, stacks of gold bullion gleamed alongside a leather-bound journal. Edward's final entries detailed Charles' plot. My nephew has bribed the board, falsified the ledger, and conspired with Crow to sink the bank. The Sister Vault holds proof. Shipments of gold laundered through North Star Ventures. But only I know the combination. Chapter 6. The Verdict of Time. The Old Bailey's courtroom seethed with tension, its vaulted ceilings echoing the murmurs of financiers, journalists, and curiosity seekers packed into oak benches. Detective Adrian Cole stood at the witness stand, his voice cutting through the stifling air like a blade. Beside him, a chalkboard scrawled with dates, time zones, and steamship routes loomed as a map of deception. Charles Whitcomb sat in the defendant's dock, his tailored suit fraying at the cuffs. Eyes hollow as the pocket watch he spun absently between his fingers. The crime, Adrian declared, was not merely murder. It was an assault on time itself. He gestured to the ship logs displayed by the prosecutor, a labyrinth of altered dates, forged entries, and the damning leap day omission. The defendant exploited the 5-hour difference between London and New York to fabricate an alibi. But February 29th, 1904, was not a day one could simply erase. It lingered, and it condemned him. Charles Barrister, a hawk-nosed man named Weatherby, sneered. Poetic detective. But where is your proof my client was in London that day? Adrian nodded to Dr. Martin, who carried a velvet box to the stand. Inside lay Mrs. Whitcomb's jade brooch, its clasp pried open to reveal a slip of paper. A receipt for the SS Lyra's gold shipment, Adrian said. Dated February 29th and signed by Edward Whitcomb. Found in Charles' possession after his uncle's death. How could he have obtained it unless he was in London? The gallery erupted. Charles' composure cracked, his fingers tightening around the watch. Furthermore, Adrian continued, the SS Laurentia's radio officer has testified that Charles bribed him to falsify the log, backdating messages to prove his presence in New York. But the ship's mechanical clock he lifted Edwards, altered timepiece, its gears exposed, reveals the truth. Adjusted to skip February 29th, it was designed to corroborate Charles' lie, a lie unravelled by the unyielding march of real time. Weatherby scoffed. Circumstantial. My client's financial manoeuvres were legal. Legal? Adrian interrupted. He signalled the prosecutor, who unveiled the Sister Vaults ledger. Charles Whitcomb drained £200,000 from London Continental Bank into a shell company, bankrupting it to buy shares at a pittance, all while framing his uncle. This is not finance. It is fraud, and it demanded Edward's silence. Charles shot to his feet, the watch clattering to the floor. You sanctimonious clerk! You think time is some noble force? It's a currency, and I spent it. The judge's gavel rang out, but Charles raged on, his voice raw. Edward was a relic. He'd have let the bank crumble. I saved it, enriched it. All I needed was one day. One day. To reset the ledger. But he jabbed a finger at Adrian. He fetishizes clocks like they're moral arbiters. They're not. They're tools. And tools can be broken. Adrian met his glare, but not laws, and not truth. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty. As bailiffs dragged Charles away, he locked eyes with Adrian, his whisper barely audible. You won't stop them. The syndicate remains. Crow was a cog. Then I will dismantle the machine, Adrian replied. That night, fog swallowed the Thames as Adrian and Martin walked the embankment. The city's heartbeat dulled to a murmur. He wasn't wrong, you know, Martin said quietly. Time is a currency. We spend it on justice. He spent it on greed. But it runs out for both. Adrian lit a cigarette, the ember glowing like a tiny clock face in the dark. No, time isn't currency. It's a river, and we're all just stones in its current. Some sink, some hold fast. Martin chuckled. Since when are you a philosopher? Since I met a man who thought he could dam a river with lies. They paused at the bridge, its iron ribs vanishing into mist. Somewhere below, the water churned, relentless. What now? Martin asked. Adrian flicked his cigarette into the void. Now we wait. The syndicate will surface. And when they do, the wind swallowed the rest. But Martin knew. They would be ready. 2 months later, a package arrived at Baker Street. A pocket watch, its gears pristine, accompanied by a note for the Tempest detective. Keep counting. Adrian placed it on the mantel, its ticking a quiet promise. Outside, the fog thinned, revealing a sliver of dawn. Somewhere, a steamship horn blared. The river flowed on.